If someone were to ask you, what is the Bible all about? Could you tell them? Is the Bible confusing because it feels disconnected? What if it feels disconnected because many of us were taught to read it that way? A verse here, a story here, a promise over here, and a parable over there. Before long, the Bible can start to feel like a bunch of separate lessons instead of one connected story. But what if those pieces were never meant to be read as separate pieces? What if they all connect? What if the story of David, the Exodus, the giants, Babel, the promises to Abraham, the words to the prophets, the parables of Jesus, the cross, the resurrection, the church, and the new creation are all part of a bigger story, a story about God's purpose for creation, a human family that was fractured, a king who came down to rescue his people, and a calling for every believer who follows Jesus. And that is what Grounded is all about. Welcome to Grounded. My name is Andrew, also known as Regular Dudes Talk, and I am glad you stopped by. I started Grounded because I wanted to understand the Bible more clearly, not just the verses that I already knew, not just the stories that I had already heard in church, but the story behind the stories. I am not a scholar, a pastor, a trained apologist. I am a husband, a father, a son, a brother, and hopefully a friend. I am just a regular dude who loves the Bible, the gospel of Jesus Christ, history, good fiction, and finding those little hidden gems in Scripture that make the whole story come alive. And the more I studied, the more I started to realize something. The Bible is not just a collection of religious lessons. It's not just a textbook. It is one unified story. And once you begin to see that story, you will never read Scripture the same way again. Grounded exists to help people understand the Bible as it was intended to be understood. By highlighting biblical connections, common threads, and recurring themes through thoughtful study, logic, and biblical discernment, our goal is to help listeners build a strong understanding of Scripture so they can read the Bible with confidence, recognize the unified story, and launch into the role that Christians have been called into. And that is why I talk so much about the story of the Bible, or more importantly, the story of God. Because Genesis through Revelation is not random. It's God's plan in Genesis 1, still moving forward to Revelation 21. The Old Testament points forward to the New Testament, and the New Testament constantly reaches back into the Old. That happens way more than most of us realize. The writers of Scripture were just not throwing random details in there. They knew what they were doing. They were writing with intention, connection, and purpose. And a lot of times, the little details that we skip right over are the details that help us understand what is really going on. That includes the strange parts, the Nephilim, the giants, the sons of God, the divine council, the weird scriptures we usually avoid because nobody seems to know what to do with them. And I get it, those topics can get strange really fast. But I'm not interested in talking about the weird things just to be weird. The point is not to chase weird ideas to drive up subs and views. The point is to understand the Bible better, because the weird parts of the Bible are not distractions from the story. Many times, they are the context that helps the story make sense. They help us understand the world of the Bible. They help us understand what the biblical authors were assuming. And they help us understand why certain stories matter, why certain places matter, and why the New Testament writers keep reaching back into the Old Testament. For example, some parables, like the ones in Matthew 13, are not random. They work together to form a motif or a pattern. Some of those patterns are what scholars call a chiasm. Each parable can draw from the Old Testament imagery, language, or story that can be traced and discovered. And sometimes they do all of that at once. And that is a big part of what Grounded is trying to do. The goal is to help regular people read the Bible with confidence, recognize its unified story, and step into the role Christians have been called to. Because context matters, the big story matters, the ancient worldview matters, The local situation matters, and the words and the details matter too. And when we miss those layers, we can easily take a verse that was written to someone else in another time, in another situation, and turn it into something that it was never meant to be. That is where a lot of confusion comes from. A lot of Christians know what they have been taught, but not always why it matters, how it fits into the larger story, or whether it is actually rooted in Scripture. And honestly, that was me too. I knew a lot of the pieces, but I did not always know how the pieces fit together. And once I started seeing the Bible as God's story instead of my story, it changed the way I understood everything. It changed how I understood faith. It changed how I understand suffering. It changed how I understand salvation. It changed how I understand the gospel. And it changed how I understand the mission of the church. And that is why some of my videos will focus on the big story of the Bible, and some will focus on the threads and the connections. Some will look at the words and the ideas we use all the time, like faith, blessings, suffering, salvation, the gospel, and the kingdom. Some will explore the strange and overlooked passages that actually help the biblical story make sense. And going forward, I want to spend more time showing how this works in practical ways. How do we read the parables of Jesus? How do we understand the familiar New Testament stories in light of the Old Testament? And how do we read Scripture in context without turning it into something only scholars can understand? Because that is really important to me. The goal is not to make the Bible more complicated. The goal is to make the story clear. And I think that matters because the message of salvation is far bigger than many of us were taught. The gospel is not just, here's how you go to heaven when you die. It's not just a message about how to live a blessed life. The gospel is the announcement that Jesus is king. And if Jesus is king, then that changes everything. It means Christianity is not just about believing the right ideas. It's about allegiance to the king. And it's about being transformed into the kind of people who reflect his kingdom. It's about carrying the light of Christ out into the darkness. And it's about taking part in the mission that Jesus has called his people into. And that is the real mission of Grounded, to help regular people see the Bible clearly, understand God's story, and recognize their place in it. So if you are new to Christianity, I want this to be a place where you can ask honest questions without feeling like you have to know everything already. And if you have been in church for years, maybe even your whole life, I want this to be a place where you can slow down, look again, and ask whether we have been seeing Scripture through the lens of the West instead of the world of the Bible. We may talk about things that challenge the way many of us were taught. We may have to rethink familiar verses. We may have to admit that some ideas sound biblical because we have heard them so often, but when we look closer, they are not. But that is not meant to tear people down. It is meant to help us read carefully, think biblically, and follow Jesus faithfully. Because the Bible lays out an epic story of how God created a human family and how that family was fractured and how he calls his children to come home. This is the story of a king and his kingdom, a rebellion and a rescue mission, a people called out of darkness and sent back into the world with the light of Christ, and an invitation to follow Jesus until he makes all things new. That is what Grounded is all about. So I hope you will join me as we read carefully, think biblically, and we stay grounded.